Well, I don't know about you, but I'm glad Amanda explained the transfiguration because I have always had a little trouble understanding that. We're going to talk about that today, and that is, she previewed the text for us this morning. This is from Mark's Gospel, from the 9th chapter, starting in verse 2. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, and he led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had been risen from the dead. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I can still picture it and feel the texture in my hands of this hide-a-bed we used to have in our basement growing up when I was a kid. It was maybe, and I know that this is hard to do, but I would enter it into the contest of the world's most uncomfortable hide-a-beds to sleep on. And not only just because it was a terrible mattress, but it was a terrible couch to sit on. It didn't do a good job in either of its 2 forms. But the pillows that were on this couch, particularly the seat cushions, were these perfect square shapes, incredibly overstuffed, very rigid and firm with this, sewn in plastic piping around the outside that made them just ideal blocks for building pillow forts. And so every available opportunity, when a friend came over, when the cousins came over, whatever, we'd go down to the basement, we'd rip off all the cushions off of all of the furniture, we'd take out all the Afghans out of the little basket that we had in the corner, and we would construct as big of a fort as possible. I don't know nobody teaches kids to build pillow forts. It's almost like it's just inborn within us. Right? We want to have those forts. We want to create those structures. We want to take the chairs. We want to hide under the table. We want to put blankets over. We want to make tents wherever we can go. And if we go outside, those forts become made out of tree houses, or they become pieces of metal or plastic that we can lean up against other things and create shelters. I bet that if any of us were given the opportunity to play in a junkyard as kids, that the first thing that we would do is construct some sort of a fort or shelter for ourselves. Because there's something about us that just says, that feels important, doesn't it? Even when we play make-believe, it's like, well, we must construct a base or a shelter or a fort or a boat or a spaceship or something where we have a structure that we can go into, and that becomes our safe place. Even before we learn to play cooperative games or sports, we're probably building forts. And as a child, I remember loving to do that and dreading the point when my mom or the moms would come into the room and say, "It's time to pick up now before so-and-so goes home." Because it always felt like we just finally made the fort perfect, and now you're asking us to deconstruct it. And somehow the task of putting the cushions back correctly on the couch and folding the blankets back up seemed to take hours, when an adult could seem to do it in less than 80 or 90 seconds. But that was what we did. That was what we did. And this probably sounds very familiar to all of you, because I think that this is just a common thing that we do. This is part of the human experience for many of us. And fort building is actually very much in the Bible. If we go back to the book of Exodus, we find that the Israelites are making their way through the wilderness. They have been rescued out of Pharaoh's hands. They are now wandering around the Sinai desert. They are looking to establish community among themselves, trying to find their identity. What does it mean to be freed people again? And as they go from place to place to place, each time constructing a new camp. Now, the way that it worked was once the people received the law, they carried the tabernacle with them. And the tabernacle was not just the box that carried the law and the commandments in it, but it was the holy tent. It was like the precursor to the temple. And so wherever the tabernacle was, the cloud of God floated overhead, and then they would move that tabernacle to wherever the cloud moved, and the tabernacle would be set up, and that would be sort of ground zero for their base camp, and then they would set up camp around there, and they would construct shelters, and they would do this out of tents or basic kind of crude primitive structures. And so the people got used to living in these structures over and over and over again throughout those 40 years. They were fort building. But for them, it wasn't recreation. It was because they were refugees. They hadn't yet entered into a land of their own. And so there were temporary dwelling places. When we get to the book of Leviticus, which is a book that I know not everybody loves to dwell in, but when we read closely in the book of Leviticus, we see that now after the people have entered into the land, they are taught ways to remember where they came from and the experience that they have been through, because those were formative years. Those 40 years were absolutely critical. And so God offers this new rule that says every year at the harvest time, after you've celebrated the harvest, and I want you to have a big blowout harvest party, but I also want you to spend 1 week, 7 days, living in booths or your own little personal tabernacles. And so people would do that. They would leave their permanent homes, and in their yards or in their community, they would build these little shacks, these little tents, huts, whatever, and they would live in these booths or personal tabernacles for 7 days. Why? Because as they were forced to live in that discomfort, they remembered their story, they remembered where they came from, where they remembered what their ancestors went through. And the fort building was a part of their spiritual DNA. Even today, many Jews continue to participate in this ritual at a festival, a harvest festival called Sukkot, and they build these booths. And so if you want to Google this, you can, but it's very interesting to see these structures that people make in their backyard, on their fire escapes, if they live in apartment buildings and urban places and so forth. Fascinating to see this practice still played out. So, fort building is a part of the story. It's a part of the heritage. It's a part of what the Jewish people did, and some continue to do today. Which I wanted to tell you that by way of background before we dive into the story today. Now, I was sort of being silly when I said that I'm glad Amanda sort of cleared up Transfiguration, but I'm sort of not, too. I mean, when we talk about the Transfiguration story, if you grew up in the Christian faith and this is a part of the teachings that you're familiar with, and you know that this is the time of year when the Transfiguration story comes up on the calendar, we've sort of probably stopped thinking about what that means and what that represents. But I want to unpack that story just a little bit more today. So, Jesus has been ministering with his disciples. He's tapped Peter and said, "You are my rock. You're going to be called Peter now. On you I will build my church." And Peter now sort of recognizes he has this sort of new responsibility, and he is really close by. Whenever Jesus is doing something, it seems like Peter is pretty nearby. He's usually kind of in the inner circle, the top apprentices that are following their teacher. So Jesus takes 3 of the apostles up to the top of a mountain, Peter being one of them. And when he gets up there without any sort of forewarning, it just says that Jesus was transfigured. And we don't really even know a whole lot about what that word means, but I guess we can understand that Jesus takes on a more higher form of divinity. He's glowing apparently in some kind of way. Light is radiating from him. It all feels like sort of this mysterious, mystical kind of vision. I'm sure that the disciples were kind of pinching themselves, and you're seeing this too, right? And all of a sudden then Moses and Elijah, these two heroes from the Old Testament, sort of figure back into the story, and they start to communicate with Jesus. And it must seem awfully bizarre. And much like the stories where people see angels in the Bible, we hear that the disciples are pretty terrified. They're kind of freaked out about what's going on. But Peter, the star pupil, realizes in this moment that this is a significant thing that's taking place. This hasn't happened before. Jesus didn't warn us about this. We're on top of a mountain, and all of a sudden he probably is thinking back. You know what? All of the other times in our history when something happens on a mountaintop, it's usually God's doing something pretty powerful, right? The commandments are being given, or maybe it's one of the prophets goes up there and receives a special message from God, or God is appearing before Moses, and Moses is going to come down kind of a different person from this experience. And so Peter says the thing that I think we would have said had we been in his shoes, which is, this is an important moment, this is an important place. All of a sudden this mountaintop becomes a sacred and holy spot, and so we should what? Build a fort. Let's build a fort here. Let's put something up, right? And at his most basic, I'm sure he's saying, like, our ancestors would designate a spiritual important spot by stacking some stones here. We build a little altar, a spot to pray. There's all kinds of stories about people saying, we're going to claim this spot for God because something special happened here, so let's build a little shrine. So maybe it's that. Or maybe it's like he's saying, oh, no. This is it. This is perfect. Like all these things have come together. The heroes of our faith have met our great teacher and our Redeemer, and they have communicated together and communed in this great, brilliant white light before us. Surely we should build a structure here. We should stay here. How is it going to get better than this? Have you ever been on vacation somewhere far away from home, and you nudged your spouse or your best friend, or you said, wouldn't it be cool if we bought a place here? Because you've all thought that, right? You've all thought that. And then part of you snaps back and says, well, wait a minute, it's probably different to live here than to vacation here, but some of you have bought places there, right? That's why we have beach houses and lake houses and mountain houses and resort places and timeshares, right? Because we get this idea that this is special. I love the way that I'm feeling here. Let's build a permanent fort. And so we have that impulse. And I think that that's what Peter is thinking. And so while we might read this story and say, Peter, this is boneheaded. Like, why do you want to build something? No, you're not going to stay there. You're on top of a mountain. There's no resources there. This is impractical. But that's not what he's thinking. He's thinking this is sacred. Everything came together. God, Jesus, Moses, Elijah, it all came together. We're a part of it. Let's stay. How is it going to get better than this? There's something else going on in this story, too, that I think is worth talking about. And it's not for sure that it's this way, but I think it's a compelling thought. In the Old Testament, in the book of 2 Kings, we hear the story of Elijah, one of the people that appears in the Transfiguration. And you may remember from Elijah's story, and I think it was, we used that text in worship a couple months ago. But Elijah is one of the people in the Bible who doesn't die and get buried. He gets taken up to heaven. Remember this story? Elijah and his protege, Elisha, are together, and this chariot comes and takes Elijah away and carries him up to heaven? Well, Jewish scholars, the rabbis, the wise sages, they said, oh, there's something important about that. There's something significant about that. If God wanted Elijah to die like the rest of us, that would have happened, but he didn't. Does that mean that he's supposed to come back? Does that mean that his work isn't done? Should we continue to wait on Elijah? This is where we get the idea at the Passover meal, where the Jews would set a spot for Elijah at the table because Elijah may come back and join us. Better leave room for Elijah at the table. So Elijah doesn't really die in the Old Testament. There are some teachings in Judaism that suggest that the same was true for Moses. Now that's interesting because in Deuteronomy it says that he was buried and died at Mount Nebo before he could enter into the Promised Land, but there were some sort of subsets of Jewish teaching that said that he was carried up to heaven like Elijah. And if that's what Peter is thinking about at this time, he's looking at Elijah, he's looking at Moses. They've come to join them in this sort of earthly realm, but they're also part of a heavenly realm. And then Jesus sort of gets called up into this moment with them, and he probably is thinking, wow, Jesus is the real deal. I know this, or I've wanted to believe this, but now I see this confirmed. And maybe he's getting carried up too. But if we build a dwelling here, then maybe we can all stay here. And it's like the last piece. All of it comes together so perfectly. But then just like that, the transfiguration moment is over. Peter suggests, hey, let's build a fort. And then God speaks. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. And it says that a cloud appeared over Jesus, and God spoke. Now again, these are a lot of little details, but think about this as you would be receiving this or experiencing this as Peter. A cloud of God is appearing at a mountaintop. You're thinking about the cloud that followed the holy tabernacle as the Israelites made their way throughout the desert. The cloud over the tabernacle, let's build a tabernacle, right? So Peter's doing the logical things. They seem illogical to us, but he's doing the things that make sense to him. But all of a sudden, don't build a fort here. That's not going to happen. But when Jesus steps to the right, the cloud shifts to the right. And when Jesus steps to the left, the cloud shifts to the left. In other words, it's not about the place that makes the place sacred. It's about who's standing on that ground that makes it sacred. You see, all the while, the Jewish people and the Israelites had put the center of God's indwelling on the earth in the place of where the law was, where the tabernacle was. When that was put in place at the temple, then the temple became that place. But now all of a sudden the cloud is following Jesus, not the covenant, not the law, not the temple anymore. So where Jesus moves, God moves. Or they are one and the same. And Jesus says, we're not staying here. We're going down the mountain. And the cloud follows. The problem with fort building, as Peter wanted to do it, is it made God's position on the mountaintop. What Jesus was trying to show them is, where I go, God goes. God walks with you. You don't have to go to the mountaintop anymore. You don't have to make pilgrimages to the temple. You don't have to carry around the tabernacle with you wherever you go. Instead, I am with you. I walk with you. Where I go, God goes. And I am with you. And not only that, but Jesus was not willing to be taken up as Elijah and maybe Moses. Jesus was not going to dodge death by being carried up to heaven. Because Jesus knows that going down the mountain meant that he would have to go down into the valley and then go up the next mountain to go into Jerusalem, where awaiting him was the cross. This is a powerful thing that I don't think often gets realized as we read the story of the Transfiguration, where there's all of this loaded meaning and detail in the story. Jesus is different than Moses and Elijah. We see, of course, that he is a step beyond that. He is one with God. But that also means that our God is not willing to say, carry me up, keep me from harm, but instead I walk into the fire with you. And where I go, God goes with. And where you go, I go with you. You see the difference here? So Peter's not a buffoon. Peter's doing all the things that he has been led to believe are the right things, but this is one of those times where Jesus says, I get it, but this time it's different. We're charting a new course now. And this one is on a collision course with the cross. And we're going to go there together. When I think about what this means for us, I guess the possibilities are really endless. I mean, how many times do we want to say, let's stay in the safety of the fort, whatever that is, instead of venturing out to do what needs to be done? How many times would we like to just sort of fast forward to the pleasant ending without dealing with the difficult part in between? How many times do we just wish that we could bypass that and a chariot could speed us to a better place? But when we look to the example of Jesus, he does not shy away from the difficult thing, the hard thing, even the thing that will lead to his gruesome death. But that's also not going to be the last part of the story either. For us today, many things might come to mind for you personally, but collectively as a church, I think that in some ways maybe this story is perfectly situated in the calendar year to be the Sunday before Lent. Because I think what many of us would like to do is we'd like to just sort of fast forward to Easter, right? We'd like to skip over the next 40 days. Like, don't wreck my Valentine's Day by smearing ashes on my head and telling me I'm going to die. I mean, I get that, right? But we also know that as people of faith, that sometimes the hard stuff is the stuff that often is the most important. Or it's certainly the stuff that prepares us for or lays the groundwork for the stuff that will be more challenging to us later. I think that we spiritually shortchange ourselves if we don't do the hard work, the messy work, the complicated, the unpleasant work of Lent. And we just move from the Transfiguration to Easter. We got to do Ash Wednesday. We got to deal with the awkwardness of Palm Sunday. We got to deal with the darkness of Good Friday. But it's going to make Easter Sunday that much better. So this year we're going to be talking about spiritual disciplines, ways that we can personally exercise opportunities, practices, age-old, centuries-old practices that help us commune deeper with God. But I think there may also be something that if we pray about this, if we consider it, there's probably something that we're trying to sidestep. There's something unresolved. Maybe it's relational. Maybe it's professional. Maybe it's about your relationship with God. Something that just don't make me leave the fort. Like, can we just stay here? But the mature part of us knows that that thing's unresolved. We need to find it. We need to uncover it. We need to address it. And it may get worse before it gets better, but it continues to sit there and trouble us in some way. Maybe that's not universally true, but I would guess for many of us that is true. But still, let's use this opportunity in Lent. Let's see this season not as something we got to get through to get to the good stuff again, but instead something that we can actually immerse ourselves in and say, if we really do Lent as it was intended to be done, how will that change us? How will that challenge us? How will that improve us? And how will that take us from one mountaintop to a next, but not avoid the valley in between? Let us pray.